Let's delve into our dawn debate now. Last week saw politicians on the campaign trail trading rather uncouth words over who was the most corrupt. Now, both NASA and Jubilee were in a competition over who has the moral authority to lecture the other on matters corruption. At some point, the politicians made corruption seem like a status quo. Now, this comes in the wake of furore on campaign financing that remains shrouded in secrecy. This is the basis of the dawn debate today. We seek to understand why corruption and politics tag along despite the camp one is in last year. IBC introduced campaign financing ceilings, but it is still not clear how when financing for the polls is being carried out. Well, we have Transparency International Director-Samuel Kimeu in studio this morning to help put this matter into perspective. Welcome to Morning Express.
Thank you very much.
And like we mentioned, we've seen a lot of back and forth this week over who has the moral authority to address matters corruption. But this all boils down into the Campaign Financing Act that was passed in 2013. 3 years later, in 2016, it was still not passed yet. Let's begin there, Samuel. Your thoughts on why it took so long to implement the Campaign Financing Act?
Well, I think, Michelle, the first thing is to put this matter into perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's quite clear now that the connection between our politics and corruption is very close. Mm-hmm. The nexus has been established over the years. And if you look at our politics keenly, especially from 1990 this way, mm-hmm. You will find that there is a scandal. There's basically a scandal or scandals for every election that we've had.
Right.
So public finances are diverted illicitly from the public and are used to finance campaigns for those who are in leadership. Mm-hmm. And those who have benefited from big contracts in government seek to perpetuate their edge and advantage over others by funding campaigns so that when the elections are over, they can then come back and reap from the investment, mm-hmm. which means that you then establish a vicious cycle where corruption feeds into politics and politics feeds into corruption. Mm-hmm. It is then not a surprise that we are wallowing in so much corruption now that everybody agrees that this country is in a bad state. But that is not going to go away unless we sanitize our politics. Mm-hmm. And we have not done that yet. The campaign financing law was supposed to enforce a provision in the Constitution that allows the IBC, as one of its functions, to regulate campaign financing. Mm-hmm. That legislation in itself was long in coming. It took no less than 6 years for that bill to go all the way from inception into enactment. Mm-hmm. When it was enacted in 2013, we thought that would be the beginning of trying to regulate campaign finance.
Right.
But last year, when the IBC had put together some guidelines on the law, Parliament was unhappy with those regulations, mm-hmm. and what Parliament did was to suspend the enforcement of the Campaign Financing Act mm-hmm. during these elections.
Right.
So technically speaking, even though the IBC has a constitutional mandate to regulate campaign financing, they are not going to do it during these elections because the law is not in place. So let's just take a look back again to history. Like you mentioned, this all began back in the 1990s when KANU also used or sought funding from businessmen, and it continued. We saw a string of scandals emerge after that. There was Goldenberg, there was Anglo leasing. But talk to us about the economic price to pay in terms of having private citizens fund political parties. Well, the risk is that you get illicitly acquired money, including from criminal cartels, drug dealers, arms dealers, corrupt people who steal from the public, mm-hmm. Determining who becomes your political leaders. And in doing that, they can actually determine the agenda for the country. Mm-hmm. They can determine what projects the country is going to engage in. They can determine the price of those or the cost of those projects. Mm-hmm. And they can also determine who does those, who gets those contracts.
Right.
So the whole issue, for example, about the the procurement. The problems around procurement that we have today are because there are people who have political debts to pay. And they will clothe all these big procurements in some veneer of legality. But the truth is, they are paying debts by ensuring that those who get government contracts are those who supported them in their campaigns.
In their campaign. I would like us to look at what other countries are doing in terms of campaign financing. But first of all, what does the Campaign Financing Act, enacted in 2013, propose in terms of curbing or putting some sanity into campaign financing?
Basically, I think the world over, there are some basic principles that are now accepted as guiding campaign finance regulation. And the first one is just the disclosures that political parties are supposed to disclose who has contributed to them to their campaigns. And in doing so, many countries have put a ceiling so that if you contribute beyond a particular amount of money, then that has to be disclosed. The other bit is that the law then bars you from receiving a particular, beyond a certain percentage from any particular person or businessman for that matter. And then the third one is that in some countries, they have banned business people or corporations from contributing to campaigns.
Right.
And so you will find that along those parameters, from disclosure to ceilings and to exclusions, you then have a lot of principles that you can apply to determine how campaigns are financed.
Right. And I think right now, Kenyans, the electorate at large has seemingly connected the dots that many times money lost in corruption is used in campaign financing and vice versa. Those also financing campaigns then end up propagating corruption in government. But at the end of the day, election campaigning is expensive. So should the Election Campaigning Act be implemented fully to the letter, where does that leave political parties in terms of topping up the campaign financing that they need?
One, basically, I don't think campaigns need to be expensive. There are a lot of resources used in the campaign that need not be used in the manner in which they are used. But the basic the basic principle of campaign finance regulation is not so much to stop people from spending the much that they want to spend, but it is ensuring that there is disclosure and that there is transparency in the manner in which those resources are mobilized.
Right.
And in so doing, shining the light on any undesirable elements who might be contributing to campaigns in a manner that could lead to them influencing the government policy and processes in the future.
Right. And of course, just to paint a picture of what we're talking about, just going back historically, Transparency International has done several reports when it comes to the transparency, so to speak, of political parties during election. Talk to us about some of the instances that we've seen campaign donors or campaign financiers actually have a hand in influencing matters of government.
Well, as it is now, it's pretty difficult to get that kind of data because political parties don't disclose all that they receive and spend. For example, the Political Parties Act requires that political parties file reports and audits
with the Registrar of
Political Parties. But if you go through those audits, they don't tell you much. As a matter of fact, you will find that many political parties would disclose what they receive from government. Because remember, political parties are part of our governance architecture,
right,
and we spend money on them as long as they meet certain parameters. And what has happened is that the enforcement of these laws is wanting, and political parties don't quite disclose these amounts. And there has been no enforcement. I think the Campaign Financing Act would have been the beginning point to force political parties to make these disclosures. They don't. And so it's very difficult to determine all this. So I think the best way of understanding how illicit money affects our politics would be to look at who has contributed to what party, and after elections and parties have a party wins, who are the people who access procurements government contracts
afterwards.
Afterwards.
All right. Now let's focus once more, just before you continue, because even while we were carrying out integrity tests on the different political aspirants who are now political candidates, we had many of them saying that they cannot be blacklisted from running in the elections because they have not been convicted of any charge, so to speak. And in Kenya, you are innocent until proven guilty. So let's take a look at what's happening currently. And there's the Jimmy Wanjigi issue currently being thrown around between NASA and Jubilee. Jimmy Wanjigi has previously financed Jubilee. He is now in the NASA brigade. NASA have not denied him as one of their financiers. But despite the controversy, there is still no charges against Jimmy Wanjigi. How then do you stop somebody like that from donating money to a political party?
You know, I think the idea is not to stop somebody like that from donating, but the idea is for Kenyans to know that he is donating, and second, to know how much he is donating.
Right.
And then to monitor what happens beyond the elections to see whether indeed contracts are going to be directed towards him. So it's not so much to prevent him from donating, but the openness and the transparency of, you know, just Kenyans knowing that so-and-so is financing so-and-so would be important.
Right.
And I will tell you on the other side why it's important, because there are people who also buy political positions through contributions, you know. So people who are positioning themselves for cabinet secretaries or other positions in government will be busy contributing in all these fundraisers and so on and so forth.
Right.
And unless we know who these people are, it's very difficult to make that connection in a very clear manner. So in terms of, you know, moving forward as a country, I think what we need is to enforce the openness and the transparency provisions that would allow us to know exactly who is contributing to what.
All right. Do you think there's the goodwill to enact to implement rather the Campaign Financing Act? Because it took about 3 years before we saw any actual activity in terms of implementing it, and it's still not applicable in the 2017 general election. Is there that political goodwill?
Unfortunately, no. I think what we have seen with Parliament is that our politicians tend not to want anything that would put hurdles on their way to
especially
what they
considering
want
it's the same politicians who are supposed to implement this law.
Indeed. So every time a piece of legislation is proposed that seeks to you know, limit certain perceived freedoms of our politicians, they are very reluctant to allow it. And when they allow it in a manner that makes it very difficult to implement those pieces of legislation.
Right.
And you've just talked about the issues of ethics and integrity, and the Leadership and Integrity Act, as well as the related laws that would be fundamental in determining who gets onto the ballot.
Right.
And even though we don't entirely agree with the institutions that are charged with this responsibility of ensuring only leaders of integrity are allowed to participate in the elections, we nonetheless do recognize that there are some gray areas that, in our view, would have been put there deliberately to make it difficult for politicians to be stopped. So I think the political will is actually lacking. And I would venture to say that this is a matter that Kenyans themselves must take into their hands and ensure that the leadership, Parliament, and the executive are actually forced to, to adhere to certain principles. Because if we don't do this, we will always be lamenting about corruption. We'll be lamenting about procurement malpractice. We'll be having NYS and many other scandals will continue to happen because we ourselves as Kenyans have not taken it seriously to try and break this cycle. So goodwill was one of the things needed, but does it also boil down to structures, especially of the institutions mandated in ensuring this? Because looking at the previous general election, it is estimated that Uhuru and Raila used in excess of about 10 billion shillings each. And most of this was never counted in their audited reports to the Register of Political Parties, despite the fact that the law says that all accounts should be, all declarations should be made both for cash and in-kind donations. That was not done. But did we see the Register of Political Parties coming out and telling these parties, you have not given us the correct information? Well, I think the structures are there. but the structures have either not shown the willingness or the diligence that is required for them to enforce their mandate. And sometimes it's easy to see how that has happened. Because remember, the office of the Registrar of Political Parties that we have today is never the office that was envisaged under the Constitution. And as far as I can recall, the holder, for example, of the current office of the Registrar of Political Parties was never subjected to any competitive recruitment after the Constitution was passed in 2010. So what what one can guess is that, this office enjoys certain level of political protection from all political parties, because there have been very few questions raised around this issue, even though there have been attempts by Parliament to normalize this office and say that it is the office that is envisaged under the Constitution through various legislations that have been challenged in court as we speak. But primarily, I think our institutions also lack the courage to come up against politicians. And as a result, there are many regulations, many laws that would help us sanitize our politics that are not being enforced. And the reason they are not being enforced is exactly that, the holders of offices are either beholden to political interests, or political parties or politicians have overwhelmed them, or they basically are afraid of enforcing the law because of the political repercussions.
Right, and it seems a bit too late in the day now to implement or start capping some of these finances that are being used by politicians now. But let's have your final comments on the way forward. 5 years from now, we will be going to the polls once again. We will have campaigns once again. What is the way forward in implementing rather, the Campaign Financing Act?
Well, I think immediately after the elections, what needs to be done is for us to revisit the campaign finance law and the regulations thereunder. And I think the IEBC must move swiftly to propose the regulations like they had proposed, so that we can interrogate them with proper public participation and ensure that they are in place before the next elections. But before that, I think what would be important is for all the other provisions relating to this issue, including the provisions of the Political Parties Act, should be enforced. And Kenyans must ensure that the officers that are given the responsibility to enforce this do so. And if they don't do so, it is open for Kenyans post the elections to make demands, including through the courts, to make sure that the full disclosures that need to be made have been made. And then using that information to ensure that there is vigilance. Because the connection between, usually the biggest problem, this country loses the most amount of money through procurement, manipulation, malpractice.
When you talk about manipulation, because we've noticed there always seems to be a gap somewhere, especially for politicians to evade the law. When it comes to Campaign Financing Act, we see it being dealt with just a few months to the general election, and of course that is not effective this time. So where do we also close that gap? It's been termed as a constitutional gap, where someone can seemingly manipulate the law in their favor. So going ahead with this, where do we really need to begin in closing these gaps?
Well, while there may be some gaps within the Constitution, I think largely it's not a question of gaps. We have sufficient laws in our view to make sure that everybody operates under the law. But we have a rule of law deficit. Our institutions are weak and sometimes do not always deliver. Our politics is such that there are people who are above the law, as in the law does not treat everyone equally as is envisaged. And I think Kenyans, in a way, have condoned this. And I think it's Kenyans who have to come up and say, enough is enough. Everybody must operate under the law. And if you operate outside the law, then the law itself must catch up with you and have you punished.
All right. Many thanks for joining us. Samuel Kimeu is the Director of Transparency International, giving us a clear perspective of the close link between corruption and campaign financing. This conversation will continue in just a few moments on the way it is. Do stay with us, but that brings us to a close on the Dawn debate. Let's take a short break. This is Morning Express. More coming up after the break.